Good morning. Today is June 21st, 2018. The time is 9:12 a.m. This is day 2 of the Physical Therapy Board of California 2-day meeting, and we're meeting at Western University, Rodney P. Weinberg Center, Cooper Hall, 309 East 2nd Street, Pomona, California. May I please have roll call?
Alicia Rabena Amen.
Here.
TJ Watkins.
Yeah.
Jesus Dominguez.
Present.
Daniel Drummer.
Present.
Katerina Elvey.
Present.
Tanya McMillian.
Present.
All members are present and the board has a quorum.
Thank you. And let's start by reading our mission, which is the mission that we adopted yesterday for our strategic plan: to advance and protect the interests of the people of California by the effective administration of the Physical Therapy Practice Act. And I want to acknowledge that we do have some public in the audience today, some students from the school, Western University, and faculty member Dr. Christine Addow. Thank you for being here. And we'll go through a little of our board business, but at some point, hopefully, I know you've got a couple tests today. Maybe at some point we can have a break and have you ask some questions if you'd like. Okay? So let's start with agenda item number 14, our ledge report.
Okay, so as noted on the calendar on page 50 of the meeting materials, August 31st is the last day for each house to pass bills, and October 15th is the last day for the governor to sign or veto bills passed by the legislature on or before September 15th and in the governor's possession after September 15th. All statutes passed will take effect on January 1st, 2019. On page 53 of the meeting materials is a legislative summary along with bill analysis and bill text for all of the bills. I'll go ahead and go through each bill and provide an update. Okay, so on page 53, the first bill is AB 2078, Sex Offenses Professional Services. The board does not have a position on this bill currently. No. And on June 7th, it was referred to the Senate Committee on Public Safety. Okay, so for moving on to the next bill, for AB 2138, Licensing Board's Denial of Application Criminal Conviction. This bill was double referred to the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee and the Senate Public Safety Committee on June 13th. And on June 18th, it was passed with 6 ayes and 3 noes and re-referred to the Senate Public Safety Committee on June 19th. And as of this morning, we received notification that it was amended. I did hand out AB 2138 proposed amendments that we received from the Senate BMP committee. And I'll go ahead and go through and do a quick summary on what most of those amendments are. I'm still going through the bill as it was amended this morning to see how many of these amendments actually made it through. It looks like most of them did. The first amendment was that, or proposed amendment that the Senate wanted to implement was that it should be amended so that it only applies to initial licensure considerations and strike the reference to suspension and revocation determinations. The second amendment would be to allow boards to consider an applicant's conviction for the preceding 7 years instead of 5 as the bill was originally written. The bill also should be amended so that serious felonies as defined in the penal code may be considered, which is more consistent with determinations made in the sentencing of a person for prior convictions. The bill language as it's written now only allows boards to consider violent felonies as defined in the penal code, which is a more restrictive list. Another amendment was to revert to existing law by requiring that a crime be substantially related. And then a sixth amendment was that an additional suggestion is that the bill should not apply to both the California State Athletic Commission and private post-secondary education. So they would be omitted from this bill. And then an additional policy consideration was regarding the reporting requirements, and that was to allow the information that's being requested or required within the bill to be absorbed into existing reporting requirements for those boards that are required to do annual reporting, and additionally provide this information during the sunset overview oversight process.
So that's a lot to chew on.
It is.
Yeah.
So I have just to clarify, these amendments were proposed or they were adopted by the B&P committee?
So we received I believe it was last Friday, we received these proposed amendments, and then this morning, as I was coming in, it looks like they amended the bill late last night. So it looks like most of these amendments made it into the bill. Go ahead.
The Senate B&P committee hearing for this bill happened on Monday morning, and there were not enough members in attendance to take a vote. And it turns out they held the roll open, and so those votes have come in. What we'll have to do is go back through this list and confirm which of the amendments were taken and which weren't, just to confirm. But I'm pretty certain that well, if not all, the majority of these were amended by the Senate, keeping in mind that this bill, after it leaves public safety, will have to come back to the Senate Business Professions Committee to rehash it all over again, if you will. So some of the things to kind of keep in mind in these proposed amendments is that it's a basic tenet of administrative law that an applicant for licensure should be treated the same as a licensee. So if something that a licensee does would lead to discipline, it could lead an applicant to a denial, and this would change that overarching philosophy. These new amendments would apply to initial licensure, which could create a second standard, if you will. The same behavior exhibited by a licensee could be treated much more harshly using the current standards and terms. But for initial licensure for an applicant, we would be bound by this bill should it pass. And so there would be two different sets of standards when we're looking at an applicant versus a licensee. The other is currently there is no statute of limitations that this board is bound by in consideration of a person's past history, which sometimes is very important considering things like pattern. And here we would be limited to that 7 years for consideration. And then the other thing that might be concerning for this board too is the legal definition of serious felonies as listed in the penal code is not comprehensive in the matter when it refers to healthcare. I mean, some of the things that would be considered egregious for us are not included on that list of serious felonies for the criminal courts. So there's still a lot to be concerned about, I guess, is what I'd like to, to exert.
So I have a question. Would you recommend, or do you have recommendation about what for the board about whether they should take a position on this bill and whether that'll help you in your advocacy about how this legislation should be amended?
Yes, absolutely. So currently, this board has an opposed position on the bill. In my mind, and my recommendation as the administrator of the program, these amendments don't alter that position. I think the positions we discussed before that caused us to take that opposition to the bill are still there. The public safety concerns are still very much, floating at the top. I mean, and really, in perspective, that's what our concerns should be, looking at those kind of things. So my recommendation and what I would ask of this board is to continue to hold that position of opposition, and even in offering another letter of opposition after these amendments have been made.
Jason, so who is the largest, who's playing the largest factor in pushing this?
I've had opportunity to meet with the author's staff on 2 different occasions now. And some of the major players are the ACLU and a couple different prisons rights advocates. And they will acknowledge an argument that they don't have numbers to support this. A number of the executive officers provided testimony to the author's staff. As an example, the testimony we provided was, the numbers for the Physical Therapy Board are infinitesimal. They're almost non-existent. Out of 2 fiscal years combined, we had a denial rate of 7 applicants for criminal history. Out of those 7, 6 were issued a probationary license and stipulation after the fact. So we have those protective measures for the public in place. And then one didn't pursue past the denial, just didn't contest the denial. So it goes to show you, out of almost 3,000 licenses issued over a 2-year period, 6 people were denied, but then turned around and granted a license under probation, and 1 person didn't contest their denial. And you saw that trend amongst the boards, that the numbers were infinitesimal, almost immeasurable. To be fair, the advocates for the bill and the co-sponsors provided argument that that only addresses one issue, because there's what they want us to consider as the chill factor. How many people didn't even apply for professional licensure because of the knowledge that their criminal history might affect their application process? And that's a very hard thing to measure. It's hard to know what the unknown is. And you can make estimates, and you could say, taking a cross-section of the citizens of the state of California, how many have criminal history? And you can compare that percentage to the number of applications we receive, and if they're very similar, it's kind of hard to say that there's that much of a chill factor. If the numbers are drastically different, then yes, you may be, just by the nature of professional licensure, chilling those people from even applying for these positions. The other thing that we've tried to address with the authors is there's a distinct difference between licensure of vocations and non-healthcare professions and healthcare professions. And there's nothing that they've addressed in these amendments to address that. So there are a number of bills, or a number of boards that, through their letters of opposition, have asked to be removed from this bill altogether, and I've seen no movement in that direction. The removal of the Athletic Commission and the Private Post-Secondary Board or Bureau is that, private post-secondary deals with companies more than it does with people, so it's appropriate. The Athletic Commission currently has lower standards than this now, so this would be actually stricter standards if it was applied to them. So those two not being included in the bill is understandable. But again, the allied health boards not having a difference between things like the Bureau of Automotive Repair or Contractor State Licensing Board is troubling. And not just to this board, but to all the other healthcare boards as well. This has probably received more letters of opposition from boards and bureaus in the Department of Consumer Affairs than any other bill I've seen.
So does that mean our only course of action is to write a letter of opposition, another letter of opposition?
It's not the only cause of action, because the other thing that I'll be asking, and it leads to Salwa's comment, is in my advocacy and my lobbying on behalf of this board, I may ask the board president or vice president to attend with me should I get the ear of one of the authors. Should I be successful in providing an appointment for us to sit down and talk with them. So,
Jason, can you remind us how many licensing boards are there?
39 currently.
And how many of those are healthcare related?
Approximately 12.
Has there been any feedback from the staff of the authors regarding the concerns of the health boards?
Yeah, only in that they've addressed, they understand our request, and they have considered it. But again, I haven't seen any outcome of that consideration. So it's just an acknowledgement of that consideration.
And I think also what I've heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the oppositions by the healing arts boards who have opposed and vocalized that opposition haven't been quite represented in the legislative analysis and notes that have been put out. Is that your impression as well?
That's absolutely correct. Other than a list, at the end of each analysis, you'll see who's in favor and who's opposed. But other than the mention of the boards that are in opposition, there isn't really any mention of us in the analysis itself. So that's absolutely correct.
So where does it go next?
To the Safety Committee.
And then back?
And then back to the Senate Business and Professions Committee.
And then to a full vote of the Senate, potentially,
Correct.
if it gets out of committee.
Correct. I
And
believe
then
it has a stop in the Appropriations Committee along the way as well.
And then would have to go back to the Assembly for review because of the amendments that have been
Correct.
made on the Senate side.
Correct. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is on the Assembly side, there was a significant fiscal impact identified in the Appropriations Committee. And I think you'll see an even more significant fiscal impact identified on the Senate side, because in the Assembly side, because it's early on, some of the boards don't always provide what the fiscal impact would be to them. And now that we're this much farther along in the process, I think you'll see a couple more boards providing, this is how it's going to affect us fiscally. And so the money fiscal impact in total for the whole department will be much more apparent.
When it leaves the safety committee and goes back to the other committee, is there room for public comment in those
Yes,
meetings?
yes. And in every committee. All of the committee hearings are open to the public, and they will take comment in support and comment in opposition. The next Business and Professions Committee will be in attendance and provide our testimony in opposition to it, as well as a number of different DCA boards. And there are a few associations, professional associations, that have provided opposition to this. So, and to my knowledge, and just keeping my finger on the pulse, I have not seen a professional association of a profession provide any kind of letter of support for it at this point.
I would be in support of another letter, a second letter. Any other feelings among the board members?
Salwa, are you ready? I move to authorize the executive officer and staff to draft a letter of opposition to Assembly Bill 2138. Do you need more information, or is that sufficient?
I was going to joke that, can you repeat that, but it was kind of a short one.
I thought I wanted to try to keep it shorter this time.
Okay, so we have a motion by Dr. Drummer and a second by Mr. Watkins. Is there any further board discussion? And any public comment?
James Sims, speaking as a public member, or not public member, licensee. Could you read, I heard the double standard kind of thing, that the applicant and then the licensee, it almost sees that this is now going to put a double standard in terms of different criteria and stuff. Can you say that, kind of clarify that again? I got a lot of it, but missed some of it.
The primary suggested amendment that came out of the Senate BMP is that these new requirements as a result of AB 2138 would only be used for initial license, so entry into the profession, as opposed to discipline that might occur for a licensee for a subsequent arrest or something like that. So theoretically, you could have two individuals, one who is licensed, one who is not, commit an act that involves very similar behavior, and one is going to be dealt with using the standards that we currently use today, and the other, these new standards that apply. So, you know, as an example, if we're trying to establish pattern for the licensee, we'd be able to look at their history in its entirety, and for an applicant, we would only be able to go back 7 years. We'd also only be able to restrict an applicant to a 2-year probationary term, where for a licentiate with very similar behavior, it could be anywhere from 5 to 7 years. The other thing I think, and we've discussed this previously, is how this affects things like the 1441 standards for substance abusing licensees. This would, because this mitigates that list down to only those violations that are defined as serious felonies in the penal code. Things like DUI or possession of controlled substances would not be a consideration for denial for licensure, but would still be a consideration for discipline for a licensee.
Who's driving this? Who's the sponsor? Do you know?
The ACLU is the primary driver, and then there are a number of smaller prison rights advocates.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
I wanted to ask for a little clarification. Is it limiting it to serious felonies, or I think my understanding was it's limiting it to violent felonies?
It was violent felonies before, but now it's limiting to serious felonies.
The other way around.
Yeah. In the very first version of the language for this bill, when it was introduced, was that a board could not consider anything but violent felonies for denial. And it was very large and broad. And now it's kind of become a little bit more refined, but I would argue it's still very large and broad.
Again, any further board discussion? Any further public comment at all? Roll call vote? Aye.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katarina Elby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillan?
Aye.
Vote carries.
It's unanimous. Okay.
Okay, so on page 57, AB 2221, Occupational Therapy Practice Act. The board currently does not have a position on this bill. On June 11th, this bill was amended, read a second time, amended, and re-referred to the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee. So AB 2386, Teacher Credentialing Services Credential with a specialization in occupational therapy or physical therapy services. This bill died in the Assembly Appropriations Committee.
Before we move on, and I know we're pressed for time, but I want to rewind back to 2138 really quick. While the board has made a motion and a unanimous decision to issue a letter of opposition, and I will continue to pound the pavement at the Capitol on the board's behalf, do you want a more assertive position on that, and having the board direct me in doing so via a motion for the record?
Direct you to,
Provide input on behalf of this board in opposition of that bill to the authors and to their staff.
do we need to direct him to do that
Well,
specifically?
so if he's asking for direction, I think the board providing direction would be a good idea.
And would you want to record it as a motion and vote?
I think it would be useful. That way we know that the board is unanimous in that position.
I was just going to say, I just reread our original letter of opposition, and my suggestion is take out the thesaurus and start using stronger language. But, you know, if you have their ear, Jason, I think that would sort of, you know, give us two opportunities to have our say heard.
So I would entertain a motion providing me that direction.
Do you have sufficient direction?
I believe I do.
Okay.
So we move to provide Jason with the director to pursue meetings, meetings with the authors and the author staff of Bill AB 2138, and present whatever the board's what we have, the board's decision on what
This
our
board's
outcome,
opposition.
opposition to the bill.
Thank
So as just like a kind of a concise paraphrase of that, to provide Jason with the requested authority and direction discussed?
Lovely.
Sure.
Okay.
I will second that.
So we have a motion by Mr. Watkins and a second by Dr. Dominguez. Is there any further board discussion? And any public comment? And roll call vote?
Alicia Benaimez.
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Elby.
Aye.
Tanya McMillian.
Aye.
Sorry. To cut you off. Vote carries 6-0. Thank you. All right, so on page 62, AB 2423, Physical Therapist Direct Access to Services Plan of Care Approval. The board does have a support position on this bill. And on June 13th, this bill was referred to the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee. AB 3013, Veterinary Medicine Animal Physical Rehabilitation. The board does not have a position on this bill, and it died in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. AB 3110, Athletic Trainers. The board currently has no position on this bill, and it was referred to the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee on June 13th.
Does the board have any questions about the athletic training bill? The most significant amendment is it creates it as its own individual board instead of putting it under the Occupational Therapy Board.
Wouldn't title protection be sufficient, or?
Title protection is what has been suggested in the last couple legislative sessions, but in this particular proposal, what we're at now is legislation that would create the athletic trainer board with its own autonomy. The scope has been narrowed quite a bit, and it still has to make it through the rest of the Senate side, and even the governor's office for that matter. And in the past, the opinion of the governor has been that it should be title protection. So we'll have to see.
And as we go through these bills, of course, any public comments welcome. Any, yeah.
I'm concerned because this bill still seems to push the boundaries of allowing athletic trainers to be able to do more than what their education provides for. And the scope of essentially patient care that they would be able to provide under this bill seems to be far exceeding what an athletic trainer is expected to do.
Can you speak to that, Jason, at all?
I think I share the same concerns as Dr. Drummer. However, the only solace that I received from the recent amendments is the entry into that practice. The definition of athlete, the definition of a sporting event, those kind of things. So the access for that practitioner to those patients has been limited. It's not as though you're going to be able to walk into an athletic trainer's practice to provide care or to be treated and provided with care. It really does limit the access that would be provided. As far as the educational standards, I'm not familiar with them enough really to provide any kind of an opinion one way or the other. And in that regard, those decisions being made at the legislative level are the most appropriate.
Any public comment?
Dr. James Sims, California Physical Therapy Association Government Affairs member, that now. We have an opposition position to this bill. It's not that we have any rub against athletic trainers, whatever, but smart legislation, smart healthcare legislation, healthcare policy should recognize the contribution and the role of the individual practitioner and how it can protect the consumer in California. It's not clear if this bill does that. There's comments in terms of protecting the public in terms of bad actors from other states coming here. Towel protection would do that. The athletic training interests have a certification process from an outside agency that vets, individuals and ethics and those kind of things that would do this. Whether it's in the best interest of the state of California to go to the level of what this bill does is questionable, and the CPTA is currently continuing to negotiate and have conversations with the authors and the legislators. It was passed out of the Assembly BNP committee on the proviso that there'd be continued workup for this bill, and it's continuing now in the Senate side as it goes through. It's not a done deal by any means whatsoever, but in terms of the political arena and how that game is done over there in the Capitol, let's just keep the discussion going and keep this kind of going for that. So that's kind of the position we're at right now in terms of, without getting into the weeds, in terms of protocols, and if the athletic trainer utilizes a protocol, isn't that tantamount to a diagnosis? Because how do you know what protocol to use if the person has a sprained ankle, or how do you know it's a fractured ankle? What protocol do you use? It's tantamount to diagnosing the individual as you go from the comorbidities that laypersons can have, that the athlete doesn't, is a kind of response to how come I can treat a sprained ankle on the 50-yard line football field, but I can't in the parking lot of that stadium of the mother. Well, that mother didn't have a pre-participation physical exam and is not a well healthy individual playing football. There could be a lot of comorbidities going on that their education and background. And I'm a physical therapy and athletic trainer for over 20 years. I know the difference between the education as we go from there, how to protect the public. And then also lastly, the protocols have kind of questionable supervisory kind of requirements to it that basically it's almost like these folks reacting almost like it is a PA. And we already have a group of individuals called PAs that do that role. So does the state of California need to spend the money and time to have this group be regulated with this here? Towel protection, probably the appropriate thing for what the complaints are that they're saying they're experiencing, but they want the 5-run home run, not just a grand slam anymore. So sorry for the sport analogy, but it's me here today. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we were expecting the sport analogy.
Glad you're back.
I had a quick question. Jason, so there exists this gray zone of overlap potentially, and I'm just wondering, could a possible scenario play out so that this board may be looking at taking action potentially on an athletic trainer for practice of physical therapy without a physical therapy license? I'm just trying to play that out in my head.
Potentially. The Physical Therapy Board, the profession itself is uniquely placed in that we have overlap with a number of other healthcare professions. The counter argument to that is that that's just more points of access for a consumer. When care is provided, as long as it's provided by the appropriate practitioner, then it's fine. This board has investigated complaints against the unlicensed practice of physical therapy for people who were attesting to be athletic trainers, unlicensed now at the time. Moving forward, I don't think that the scope here is going to change that. We may still be investigating complaints of unlicensed practice of physical therapy. There's a lot to look at when it comes to intent and those kind of things. One of the things that we touched on about the issue with supervision for athletic trainers in this current bill is that treatment can't be provided to a patient unless it's under the supervision of a physician or surgeon. So there's a very narrow gateway that an athletic trainer will have to go through to be able to render those services. And having said that, I don't think that's going to alleviate the possibility that athletic trainers might still stumble into the PT scope of practice or the occupational therapy scope of practice or even the acupuncture scope of practice for that matter. There's a lot of overlap. And again, it's something that we as administrators of regulation have to deal with on kind of a daily basis. But at the same time, again, the counter argument being the more variety that a consumer has to be provided services that might provide them relief and remedy of their ailments, that much the better.
So in just looking at the current version of the bill and the requirements for supervision by a physician, the piece that still very much concerns me is the idea of a protocol, which is still an option for an athletic trainer to be able to initiate treatment for a person, for an athlete or somebody who participates in an athletic activity under the guise of a protocol. That requires the athletic trainer to be able to provide a diagnosis as to what protocol they can use and what protocol is appropriate for that injured person, the person injured in an athletic activity, which includes exercise and mobility and does not necessarily mean in a game. And so the idea of that the protocol piece still remains is of great concern to me, because protocols are really, they're specific things that are applied to very general areas and when they shouldn't be.
And again, I agree with that concern. The only other thing that I would add to that is this is legislative language, conceptual in nature currently. But even if this language passes and the bill is signed by the governor and goes into effect, there's still a regulatory process that will, that particular board will have to go to create that board's regulations to make these statutes more specific or clearer. Not to say that I think that the protocol issue would be addressed there. It could be to a certain extent, but I don't know if any regulation would alleviate that concern in its entirety.
Also, what is the overlap, if you were to identify the overlap into the physical therapy of athletic trainers? Because, and the reason why I ask is because the general public would not know the difference if they've never been exposed to physical therapy, going to an athletic trainer. And when you talk to athletic trainers, sometimes when I speak to athletic trainers, they speak in the language of, I can fix this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's lay people.
Correct.
And it's kind of interesting for me because I've seen that. I know regular people that go to athletic trainers. I just wanted to know, what's that overlap? Is it bigger than with our relationship with other boards? Is this the primary, not to a threat, if you will, or the infringement of our Practice Act?
So that nature to want to be able to help and fix an ailment, and as a layperson is currently happening, once in a while we'll receive a complaint. In investigating that complaint, the terminology used or the advertisements used borderline on the scope of physical therapy, and we've seen complaints come before the board in that matter. However, currently it's an unlicensed vocation, and so being unlicensed sometimes also allows it to fly up below the radar a little bit more. Sometimes licensure is required because of some, a bad thing happened, a fire was lit, and the legislature had to put it out to protect the public. And so licensure is born. I don't believe that's the case here. I believe the case here is driven by the profession itself, and they're looking for that kind of recognition. But having said that, I think that concern is still there to try and determine their scope. And as Dr. Drummer alluded to, protocols being something that cannot be employed without a diagnosis. And this bill by no means entitles them to be able to diagnose, creates that confusion even further. While they might be under the supervision of a physician or surgeon, a great many of them are now as lay people, and we still have those same issues.
Mm-hmm. Does the board have a recommendation on a position, or does executive officer have a recommendation on a position?
If I were to make a recommendation, I would make a recommendation to watch the bill currently.
Mm-hmm.
I would be troubled in trying to provide a recommendation of the board providing a letter of opposition to this bill, only in that we're in our arena and they're in theirs. And this is being, contemplated, pontificated by the legislature, and this language is conceptual at this point. And as Dr. Sims alluded, I do believe that this bill will change drastically through the Senate side. But having a watch on it, we will have an opportunity at one more meeting.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a motion by any board member? Ooh, public comment? Thanks, Daniel.
Jameson, speaking as a licentiate, not representing an association or an education institution right now. There's kind of almost like an in-betweener position also, and that would be opposed unless amended. If there's concerns of the board that there can be some issues that you definitely would like to see addressed, rather than taking a watch position where you can kind of just hope those get addressed, you could be an opposed unless amended and state what those potential concerns are you have regarding this. It's a little more beyond this. I mean, conceptual would be kind of the initial, demonstration of the bill, but it's been through a couple committees, appropriations and Assembly B&P, that the concepts are getting established. It's more than just that. And so there's kind of that tweener position where oppose unless amended, share with the authors and the legislators, what those concerns are of this bill that you'd hope be addressed, and they're going to help drive the future discussions regarding this issue. It's got to happen quick. This bill's up for the hearing on Monday, the 25th, or the 25th, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it'd have to be maybe a verbal and or quickly written opposition or kind of comments. Here's our concerns as a licensing entity. Right now, it looks more like a registry rather than a license type entity. There's a very peculiar funding mechanism that I wonder if this board would have. We're going to take donations, and the donations come from the California Athletic Trainers Association, the fox guarding the hen house, so to speak. I mean, a very peculiar, I've never seen a funding mechanism for a regulatory event be done by donations and by the persons who would benefit the interests of the persons from that bill. Kind of really peculiar to see that. And that's why, boy, it's new to me. I've been around government affairs about 15 to 20 years now, and I guess stay around long enough, you'll see different things every year, maybe. But so that'd be kind of the tweener position that this board could potentially do.
Mm-hmm. Any recommendation from the board or any motion from the board? or further discussion?
I move to authorize the executive officer and staff to develop a letter of opposition unless amended. For AB 3110.
We have a motion by Dr. Drummer and a second by Ms. McMillian. Is there any further board discussion?
Do you need
Can-
specifics about the pieces of the?
I would,
to
I would
develop?
certainly
You'd ask for
appreciate
those?
what amendments the board would be looking for.
I have a question. Is that, you see, the original position is to what? And I'm just a little concerned that this is too strong a move for where it is in the process. Can you clarify that for me? Because if our initial position is to watch and now we're taking an official opposition letter response and it's this far in the process, are we touching this too soon? Or do we need to let it play out a little to let things clear out a little?
I'm not concerned with the letter being issued being too soon in the process, because again, while we have a teleconference that is will be scheduled that this business could be entertained at, we are on the second side of the legislative houses, and this bill has significantly changed from the last time this board offered a watch position. So it's not so much my concern is that it's too soon in the process. But I may have no concerns at all. After I hear what the proposed amendments might be that we would take forward, they may be very legitimate and the perspective coming from the Physical Therapy Board might be appropriate. But again, I'd have to, we have to kind of hash out what those amendments that we'd like to see to the language are.
So would that be stipulated in this letter of opposition?
Correct.
Would you clarify this is the direction that we want to see this
Absolutely.
if this proceeds?
Anytime we draft a letter that's opposed unless amended, we should have recommendations of what those amendments would look like.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
So, and just to rephrase my question, do you want, in the motion to oppose unless amended, with direction, or do you want the direction in that, of those areas to you with the motion, or
Yes,
is our discussion here?
I would appreciate that.
Okay, I'm Christy Netto, assistant professor here at Western University of Health Sciences. I'm a practicing physical therapist. As someone who works at a university that really emphasizes interprofessional education, and I mentor all the different professions trying to learn about one another, I have deep respect for my physician colleagues. However, I don't feel that in their training they necessarily understand the depth of what physical therapists do. So I'm not necessarily that comfortable with someone like an athletic trainer doing something that would be under our Practice Act and knowing that it's physical therapy. So that's just, I wanted to express that.
Thank you. So do we have any suggestions for amendments that we'd like to see?
So, as I discussed earlier, one of my primary concerns is about the use of a protocol that does not require a physician's direct oversight to be able to diagnose and initiate treatment for a person injured in an athletic activity. A second concern of mine is about just the term athletic activity, the overly broad nature of what is described, how that is defined, to essentially include anyone who's been injured while they're moving.
I have a suggestion as well. Second page of the bill, second paragraph down, discusses that it would authorize the Director of Consumer Affairs to seek and receive donations from the California Athletic Trainers Association and any other private person or entity. I think that's an obvious conflict of interest, as Dr. Sims mentioned, and I don't think that corporate donations or donations from the professional association is appropriate in developing this board.
Jason, just out of curiosity, what was the last health board that was created?
The Occupational Therapy Board.
And how were they created? Did they use startup funds from their association?
The startup funds provided, if I recall correctly, the startup funds provided for the Occupational Therapy Board's creation came from the Department of Consumer Affairs as in the form of a loan that was repaid after the board was established and the licensing population had started paying its renewals. And I believe that it took maybe 2 or 3 renewal cycles for those funds to be repaid back.
Relatively fast.
Not, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's 6 to 8 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
So we have a motion and a second. Any further board discussion? And any further public comment?
Can we take a straw poll on the direction that was provided, that everyone's in agreement? I think there were 3 items identified for amendment, 2 by Dr. Drummer, and the conflicts of interest question by Ms. Ellaby. So straw poll on that?
If we agree.
Mm-hmm. On that set of amendments for Jason to move forward with.
I'm okay with the amendments that we've expressed.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Yes. So can we have a roll call vote?
Alicia Van
Aye.
T.J. Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Ellaby.
Aye.
Tanya McKnight.
Aye.
6 to 0. Motion carried.
So the motion was opposed unless amended? Mhm. Okay.
Moving on to page 66.
SB 1298, the Increasing Access to Employment Act. This bill died in the Senate Appropriations Committee. And the next bill is SB 1448, Healing Arts Licensees Probation Status Disclosure. and this bill was amended on June 11th, read a second time, amended again, and on June 19th was referred to the Senate Appropriations Committee.
And is it just for those boards mentioned in the bill?
Correct.
Podiatry, naturopathic medicine, chiropractors, acupuncture?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Anything else for us, Brooke?
No, that's all for the ledger report. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Thank you so much. Okay. Can we move on to agenda item number 16, the Consumer and Professional Association's Intergovernmental Relations Reports? And we'll start with Federal of State Boards of Physical Therapy, FSBPT. I just attended a regulatory training, very good training that spurred some dialogue and will continue to spur some dialogue with making sure I'm clear on things with Jason. And we've got the Leadership Issues Forum coming up next month. A few of us attending, which would be great. Jason, anything from DCA?
Yes, I do have a written update from DCA. They could not be in attendance today. And so Karen Nelson, the Assistant Deputy Director of Board and Bureau Services, provided me with a written update. I'm not going to attempt to impersonate Ms. Nelson, although she thought that that would be a way to liven up our meeting. Thank you. I don't think I would pull it off very well. So in the update, the first reference is the Director's Quarterly Meeting and Leadership Call. At the last Director's Quarterly Meeting in April, they discussed a number of important topics, including pro rata, the Executive Officer's Salary Study, and various department procedures and policies. Additionally, at that meeting, Director Dean Grafilo shared with the Executive Officers and Bureau Chiefs his intent to host regular conference calls with boards and Bureau leadership. The board member and advisory committee leadership call is scheduled for this upcoming Monday, June 25th, and we hope your leadership will be available to participate. These quarterly meetings are an opportunity to ensure that the director is available to the board to hear important issues facing the department and its boards and bureaus. The next director's quarterly meeting is scheduled for Monday, August 6th, and they ask that you please note that on your calendar and make yourself available. And please note that this is a new date from our previously reported date in July. Under the licensing enforcement work groups, on April 10th, the department hosted its first licensing and enforcement work group meeting. With over 60 in attendance, they convened with executive officers, bureau chiefs, and key licensing and enforcement staff, and began to identify business processes that will strengthen the boards and bureaus in the areas of licensing and enforcement. The monthly work group meetings will dive deeper into these processes and codify some best practices. The first enforcement work group meeting was held on May 14th and took a closer look at performance measure number 2 and the business process associated with enforcement intake. The licensing work group met in June and discussed fingerprint matching and utilizing cloud-based solutions for collecting licensing supplemental documents. The next enforcement work group meeting is scheduled for July 9th and will feature a presentation from the Department of Justice and its Section 312.2 report. The Substance Abuse Coordination Committee, on April 23rd, DCA reconvened the SACC per SB 796. The SACC has been tasked with examining Uniform Standard Number 4 related to drug testing standards for substance abusing licensees in a diversion program or in programs that have been adopted by the Uniform Standards. The committee will determine if the existing criteria needs to be updated based on a recent development in testing, research, and technology. Report its findings to the legislature January 1st, 2019. The committee has requested a follow-up meeting to discuss a range of topics, including testing frequency, schedule, and testing laboratories before changes to uniform standard can be considered. And that next meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday, June 27th. Per statute, the committee is made up of the Healing Arts Board's executive officers and designates from the California Department of Healthcare Services and is chaired by the Director of the Department of Consumer Affairs. And as always, please let them know if the department can be of service to your board, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact Christopher Castrillo. And all the best from Karen Nelson and Christopher Castrillo.
Can you tell us anything about the EO salary study?
Yeah, I was in attendance at that director's quarterly meeting. The EO salary study is, while it's been done in the past, we're going to hire an outside vendor to come in and do an assessment of the executive officers in the Department of Consumer Affairs, determine if their compensation is fair in consideration of civil service tables, and take kind of a deep dive look into the complexity of each board, the size of the board, the financial or fiscal responsibilities of each board, growth in the past 10 years of that board, and look to see if there is a recommendation that they could make to California HR as far as reclassifications and the like. So it's something I think that, because of the nature of the executive officer position, should be done on a fairly frequent basis. Boards have grown immensely and exponentially in size over the last 10 to 15 years, and so those adjustments might not align with the current civil service classifications. So that assessment will be done by, again, an independent third party to come in and do an audit, if you will, and determine if where each executive officer is sitting currently is appropriate or if an adjustment needs to be made.
Any information on timeline?
I believe that the vendor selection is supposed to happen before the end of this year. The audit itself usually takes between 8 to 12 months. So any change recommendations being provided to CalHR, I think, will be made in the latter part of 2019 or the early part of 2020.
And in the past, there was another study done, 2011 or so, and there was information that was not allowed to be considered, I believe, in that particular process. And so I'm just wondering, how transparent is this process going to be? What can we expect?
The last survey was done 2010, 2011. During that time frame, California was in a bit of a financial crunch, and so in an effort to save money and make sure that we weren't spending beyond our means, for that matter, a number of criteria that should be considered weren't. And an example of that would be considerations of what other EOs are paid for in other states and those kind of things. So the assessment that was done by the independent third party at that time, which was CPS, did not include contacts with like individuals from other states or even other departments within the state of California, for that matter. Mm-hmm. So it was a very narrow scope, if you will. I think that the intent moving forward now is to include that criteria. And as far as transparency, I believe that the initiation of this study by the Department of Consumer Affairs is a good sign that they understand that there might be an imbalance and an acknowledgement of that understanding. And so I would expect that that assessment would be impartial and would provide clarity that everybody needs.
And you mentioned another date coming up for the leadership teleconference with the director?
Yes.
I'm sorry, what was the date that you mentioned? So there's one on this Monday, the 25th.
This Monday, and that one is for the board member and advisory committee.
And then did Karen Nelson mention a second date coming up?
The actual quarterly meeting with the director, which includes executive officers and board chairs and vice chairs, is scheduled as August 6th.
August 6th. So this meeting, this teleconference on Monday, the 25th, is something new, and it is a teleconference that has invited board chairs and vice chairs, presidents, vice presidents, and
that's correct.
This is an opportunity for the director to give us information directly, and then for us to also respond and give our concerns or any questions.
That's correct. And I would assume in that particular meeting, as stated in the update, is an opportunity to ensure that the director is available to the board to hear important issues facing the board. So it's an opportunity for our board's chair and vice chair to have the ear of the director, if you will.
So I'd just like to invite board members to give TJ and I any input that you might have that you'd like us to bring to this teleconference. If you have any, we'd be happy to do that, as well as public comment. Any other questions on the DCA report? Comments on the DCA report? Okay, thank you,
So
Jason.
I think it would be a good idea to take a straw poll kind of to indicate whether or not there's board support to have the chair and provide authority to the chair and the vice chair to attend this meeting
Sure.
and represent the board.
I agree.
And Dr. Drummer?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and do we have a report from CPTA today? They're here, they're participating, thank you for being here. Jason, anything from you with regard to CPTA?
Only in consideration of the 2019 calendar and understanding that CPTA's annual convention is going to be held out of state, that this board will do what it can to try and make sure that we can attend and provide outreach. But just asking that CPTA understand that having it outside of the state of California might make it difficult, considering the executive order prohibiting out-of-state travel, and that it would have to be considered mission critical for us to do it. Again, we'll do what we can to be in attendance. We'd very much like to be included and be there, but because of that executive order, we might not have a choice.
Okay, thank you. So I propose that we take a short recess and then come back and continue on with agenda item 19.
Before we recess, can we take public comment on
Yeah.
16?
Okay.
Sure. Any public comment regarding FSBPT, DCA, or CPTA?
No, and while this might not be public comment, we still have agenda item number 15.
Oh, sorry about that. Skipped one. Oh, we have rulemaking report, agenda item number 15. Thank you so much. Okay, Brooke, you want to take that now?
Or after the break, it's up to you.
Let's take a short recess and come back and do rulemaking.
All right.
Thank you. We're back on record. The time is 10:37, and I apologize for skipping over agenda item number 15, but we're ready for that now.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go right to the rulemaking tracking form, which is on page 242 of our meeting materials. And it lists all the rulemaking items that were adopted from the 2018 rulemaking calendar that was adopted at the November 2017 board meeting. The first item on the rulemaking tracking form is the satisfactory documentary evidence of degree for licensure as a PT or PTA coursework tool. Proposed regulatory language was presented to the board at the May 2017 meeting, and PTB staff are in the process of working on the initial rulemaking package for submission to DCA Legal for their review. The second item on the rulemaking tracking form is setting an examination score for the National Physical Therapy Examination. PTBC staff are in the process of incorporating DCA Legal's edits and will submit the rulemaking package for further review to DCA Legal within the next few weeks. The disciplinary guidelines is the next item on the tracking form, and final language was approved at the March 2018 meeting, and PTBC staff are in the process of finalizing the notice and the initial statement of reasons, which are part of the rulemaking package to submit to DCA Legal for review within the next few weeks. And all additional items on the rulemaking tracking form were added from the 2018 rulemaking calendar. And we are still researching most of those items, and we'll hopefully be presenting additional language at future board meetings.
So we're still awaiting future languages or, language to consider.
Correct. Yes, for
Okay.
board consideration in future meetings.
Okay. Any board comment on the rulemaking tracking forms or the rulemaking process? Any public comment on rulemaking? And any additional comment from you at all, Jason?
Just two things. Having 3 different packages at about the same level going into review for DCA and for submission to OAL is quite a bit to juggle. And with the new review process, it's very difficult for us to make estimates as to how long it's going to take. It's a new process, but because of that, we were also able to renew our retired annuitant position for Rebecca Marco for another year, because we know that the review process itself might take that long, and so having her there to maintain the file along the way is very helpful, and so we thank her for agreeing, if you will, being voluntold, as the board's former executive officer to help us with that. We really appreciate it. And again, moving forward, I believe, maybe not at the next meeting, but at the December meeting, there are a couple other packages that are on the calendar that will have language to introduce to the members to consider.
Yeah, I remember some lively debate over the foreign educated language or possible language, and so I look forward to that. Okay. Any other further discussion by the board? Any public comment? Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Jason. So it looks like we can pick up with agenda item number 19, Administrative Services Report.
So for staff reports, for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them to the members and then ask if there are any items as a review of those materials that you have. I will try to answer them the best I can, if they are beyond my knowledge, I will bring the appropriate staff down to help me and assist. So starting with the budget report, if there's anything that is notable or of concern, I will tell you that we are still in the throes of the transition to Fiscal.
Okay.
And so most of what you see before you is internal tracking that either my staff or DCA staff is helping us do.
Okay.
We still don't have reconciliation reports from the Fiscal system to really know where we are. We do know that month 1, or essentially last July's, the first month of the fiscal year, is completed, but in going through those reports, it's not a accurate capture of those statistics, and so we provided it back, and while they have month 1 and they're fine-tuning it to make it align better with what we have in records that we know to be true, things that we can verify, they are working on month 2, 3, 4, and so on. So you will see some comparison numbers in our materials where we are trying to compare to what DCA has or what Fiscal has. And unfortunately, there's some drastic percentage differences, and it's only because, and most notable is one of the revenue numbers that it doesn't show, that we've collected enough essentially to cover our own budget. And in our research looking at it, they're not capturing the correct period of time or the correct allocation classes. So while it says that we're severely under in collection of revenue, that's not actually the case. We're right on pace from what we can see.
Do they know that?
They do, but there's not much that they can do about it currently until they get the Fiscal transition under control.
So at our last meeting, we had Carl and another gentleman from DCA.
Correct.
And he did tell us, I believe, if I recall correctly, that they had month one complete.
Correct.
And they were looking forward to moving forward pretty quickly.
And I believe this many months later, we're in that very same position.
Okay.
So in that regard, the fiscal transition hasn't changed much progress-wise. We're right where we were before because we realized that there was some errors in the data and they're correcting that. But I think you'll also recall that, and it was Mr. De Los Reyes from DCA Budget said, from what they can see as far as revenue expenditures, we're living well within our means, and we'll have a reversion to an ARF, or an architectural revolving fund, of over $200,000, and still have a reversion back to the PT fund. The statistics that you have in your book, there is one in particular that the percentage doesn't indicate that. In fact, it says we haven't covered enough, essentially, to cover what we spent this year alone. And it's just because when they ran that report and provided it to us, they're not capturing the correct period of time or the correct allocation codes. So it's an anomaly, it's an error.
So as we move forward, will those be corrected?
That is the intent, as we learn how to navigate around Fiscal better, but also at the same time hoping Fiscal becomes more accurate of a product. So, and again, that doesn't affect just the PT board. That affects the majority of the departments in the state of California. Fiscal is the accounting software that's being used not just by the Department of Consumer Affairs or agency for that matter, but for just about every government agency within the state of California.
I wonder if this is something that would be important to bring up at the directors meeting with the leadership of boards on Monday, perhaps? So.
I would tell you that they're well aware of it.
Okay.
But, just providing that as a concern, I think is certainly welcome.
Okay. You might have more information for us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And Jason, do they have, I'm sure, because he spoke to it, that they have the base numbers, they know what is actually going on. It's just that we are trying to put this on a system that captures it, that automates it, because that's why I think they're struggling with month number one, because month number one in an automated system is probably the most difficult. And in that first quarter to line up those numbers and do the reconciliation. So timeline, what are they looking at, or is that too, that's an IT question. It's like.
It's an IT question that if you had asked me, in the first quarter of that fiscal year, I might be better apt to answer. Because I believe the timeline was that they would have the report issue resolved, the reconciliation report issue resolved within 2 to 3 months. And so we're a little bit past twice their expectation, almost to the third power. And so I would hesitate to provide, any kind of estimate into how long it's going to take. We're getting close to that year's data being closed out anyway. This fiscal year is coming to a close. So I think there's a sense of urgency to be able to close out and do what they call month 13, which is essentially the year in its total, the 12 reports combined into the year end. And so they've probably shifted some of their priority to that, so that boards can reconcile their accounts, maybe not knowing the complete details in line items, but also being able to know the bottom line is accurate and that we have everything accounted for. So we've, with the assistance of staff, have been very frugal. We've been watching the money, not knowing and not being able to balance your checkbook. It creates a bit of tension or stress a little bit. So the unknowing is the worry. But as much as we're watching it, I'm very comfortable.
I think that's great that you're watching it and your budget team is watching it in-house. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, any further comment?
I had a question, Jason, about the architectural revolving fund. What is our target to put aside for that move?
If I could probably answer that better if I knew what our target was at this point when it comes to the move. There's still a little bit left for us to resolve as far as if we're staying in the same building, because then I could start to estimate moving costs, whether it's across town or just upstairs. Second to that is I know that the space that we are in now again, I've said it before, was designed for 11 to 13 people, and we're now between 20 and 25. So we have to have DGS and DCA come out and do a survey that essentially measures how many square footage you should have, per cubicle, per analyst, but also things like circulation, the ability to walk around. And when they say circulation, they mean circulation, not just your ability to navigate around each other, but to make sure that there's enough air in the room for everyone to share without, having to crank the AC too high because bodies are generating heat. I mean, it's all included. And while we can do our own estimates based on what those guidelines are, it's very hard for us to take action on estimates. I actually need DGS to come out and do that survey and provide that official, notice of what square footage we should be looking for. So our attempt at, well, not our attempt, but our setting aside monies in an ARF last fiscal year and setting aside monies in this fiscal year is just trying to be proactive towards that goal. It's an estimate. And it's a conservative estimate. So the monies that we've set aside, we hope we're not going to have to expend. I don't anticipate $400,000 worth of moving costs just to move everybody upstairs into a larger suite to accommodate the growth. The nice thing about an architectural revolving fund is that those monies that aren't encumbered or aren't spent, they just go back into the general or into the PT fund. If, and for that matter, if we don't ever move, because we have to move, but if we ever did not move, the ARF would expire and those monies would go back to the PT fund. So it's just a way for us to set those aside for that very specific instance or that need of a move. And it includes things like construction and build out, purchasing of cubicle furniture and that kind of thing. So.
Any other comments on the administrative services report? Any public comment? Thank you, Jason. Let's move to the application services report. Any questions from or concerns from board members or anything that you want to bring to our attention, Jason?
You'll see that in Sarah Connolly, the manager over the unit, in her briefing paper, she just draws to the board to the attention of there's that static increase of about 3 to 5% in applications received. And in just trying to get the lay of the land and looking out, we do see that there are a number of programs in development at the CAPD level. So growth, I think, is going to continue to be constant. And with growth, obviously, comes a greater workload. The more licensees that are out there, the more renewals that we have, the more continuing education audits we have. Unfortunately, because of the matter of the mechanic, we also have a greater number of complaints with a larger licensing population. So the enforcement program is also impacted. And then most importantly, the application unit itself. We're getting to a point now where we have enough staffing to catch up to the demand of the application line, but we're also falling behind that too, so we're going to have to always keep an eye on that and assess what staff requirements there are. If we see this constant growth that we've seen in the last couple of fiscal years remain constant, which we think they will, there will be a need for us to attain more staff to keep that expediting of the application process going.
Okay. Hi.
This is Mitch Kay. I'm a physical therapist. A question that I'm always getting are the PT applicants, once they receive their passing grade, how long does it take before they get their license and can practice and earn a decent salary?
So to answer your question, Mitch, assuming that all of the deficiencies in the application process are met, the license can be issued within 45 days. And that's because of the static volume of applications that we're receiving, fixed date testing and applying score reports to each individual application. But again, that's dependent on every deficiency in that application being met. All the documents required, all the proof of education required, a passing score for the MPTE as well as a passing score for the California Law Exam. once that last score, that MPT score is passed, we won't actually receive those scores for an additional week. The FSBPT holds them so that they can do a forensic analysis of the data before they release those scores to the jurisdictions. And when we receive scores, we receive them in the number of almost in proportion to the number of applications we receive. So that's, you know, hundreds and hundreds of scores that need to be applied to each file before a licensure determination can be made.
So there's a difference between what you do prior to allowing them to take the exam versus afterwards? Wouldn't some of those deficiencies you're talking about?
Yeah, some of them are absolutely addressed at that point, but the majority of workload in that last final stage is the application of that score and receiving it from the administrator of the exam.
So it might possibly take longer after the July fixed testing date because of the number that are testing? Or?
Yeah, the July exam is unique in that there are two dates because it's a higher demand a greater number of graduating classes. Mm-hmm. The application workload does go up quite a bit. The other thing I think to consider also is a good number of people who have taken the MPTE and maybe assume that their application isn't deficient, learn that their application was. And so while they passed the MPTE, they've not registered or taken the California law exam. And so they're not going to get anything other than PTLA status at that point. And so sometimes in correspondence that, you know, works itself out and they reach out asking what the status is of their application and learn that they still have one more exam to take. Or that they failed to respond to correspondence requesting a copy of their, you know, P1E or their certificate of completion of education or something like that, or even just an omission on the application pages itself, you know, and not addressing that correspondence. So in outreach, we try to really kind of exercise that caution to applicants that if they receive an email or a mail notification from the Physical Therapy Board, please open it, please address it, and please answer it so we can get your license, you know, issued as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, the way that it's a very assembly line-like system. So if we've sent that letter out, we're expecting a reply. And while we have ticklers on our calendar to go back and make sure that we don't let too much time lapse before a second notice goes out, we still are at the mercy of that applicant and answering to that correspondence. So there's a lot of back and forth.
Okay. Any further board comment? I just want to mention that I did have a conversation with a representative from FCCPT, which is a credentialing agency for foreign educated applicants, and she was very excited and thankful, appreciative of California allowing her to submit the P1Fs digitally, electronically versus paper form, and I wanted to pass that on to you. She's very appreciative of that.
Wow. It is the wave of the future.
Yeah.
And for eligibility, it's something that I think is appropriate. We would still require it in print before a license is issued, but in that process, it does help expedite in total the process. So we're happy to do it.
Okay. Okay. Any further public comment on application services? Let's move on to licensing services.
Again, if you'll draw your attention to Sarah Connolly's briefing paper, one of the things that she would like to call out is the increasing use of retired status, and in correlation, the decrease in use of the inactive status. I think that was to be expected. I mean, we talked about it at great length that once people found out that they could effectually get the same thing and not have to pay, that would be the route that they take. So while retired status is a potential revenue loss, I think it's appropriate, and I think it's more than minor and absorbable.
Does anyone have any information regarding the PT PTA workforce and any foreseen boom in retirement in the upcoming years?
We haven't looked at that data in quite a while, but the fiscal year before last, we did do an assessment of birth dates versus active licenses to determine who would qualify or be a candidate for retirement. But one thing I can tell you is that maybe the physical therapy profession in particular, that number doesn't have the same effect that it might have. PTs don't retire at the same age as what the Social Security system or the employment systems might, estimate the age to be. But there are, I think, quite a number of candidates as we move from one year to another in the baby boom generation to the next that are definitely candidates for retirement.
Any further board comment or questions? Any public comment? Okay. Anything else, Jason?
Under this report is the continuing competency services report as well, and you'll see that there are a number of requests to have recognition removed, and I'd like to go through them one by one so that we can get your affirmation and move that process along.
A motion, a second, and a roll call vote for each one?
It's most appropriate to do it that way.
Yeah, that's what we would recommend.
So we can start with the first one, which is ABA Physical Therapy Associates.
I move to remove ABA Physical Therapy Associates from our continuing competency approval agency.
Second.
Further board discussion? Public comment? Roll call vote?
Alicia Benhaven.
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Elby.
Aye.
Tanya McMillan.
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
Thank you. BOEM workshops?
Boheme Workshops, Inc. Any questions or comments?
Move to remove approval agency recognition for Boheme Workshops, Inc.
Second.
First by Dr. Drummond, second by TJ Watkins. Further board discussion? Any public comment? Roll call vote?
Alicia Benhaven.
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Elby.
Aye.
Tanya McMillan.
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
So moving on, CHA Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center.
We're just going down the line.
Approval agency recognition from CHI Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center.
Second.
Motion by TJ Watkins, second by Dr. Drummer. Any board discussion? Any public comment? Roll call vote?
Alicia Benhaven.
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Elby.
Aye.
Tanya McMillan.
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
Next in line is Encompass Consulting and Education, LLC.
I move that we remove Encompass Consulting and Education LLC from our approved vendor list.
Second. Motion by Katarina Ellaby, second by myself. Any board discussion? Public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benhaven.
Aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katarina Elby.
Aye.
Tanya McMillan.
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
Next in line is Evidence in Motion.
I move to withdraw recognition from Evidence in Motion.
Second.
We have a motion by TJ Watkins and a second by Tanya McMillan. Any board discussion? Any public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benhaven.
Yeah, aye.
TJ Watkins.
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez.
Aye.
Daniel Drummer.
Aye.
Katerina Elby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillan,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
And the next for consideration is Medical Consulting Media, Inc.
I move to withdraw approval agency recognition for Medical Consulting Media Incorporated.
I second that.
Got a motion from Ms. McMillan and a second from Mr. Watkins. Any board discussion? Any public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benjamin,
Aye.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katerina Elby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillan,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
And then up for consideration is OnlineEUs.com Incorporated.
I move to terminate OnlineCEUs.com, Inc., recognition of approval.
Second.
Motion from Ms. McMillan, a second from Mr. Watkins. Any board discussion? Any public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benjamin,
Aye.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katerina Elby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillan,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
The next for your consideration is Rehab eLearn.
I move that we remove Rehab eLearn as an approval agency.
Second.
We have a motion by Ms. Ellaby and a second by Dr. Drummer. Any board discussion or public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benjamin,
Aye.
TJ Watkins,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katerina Elby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillan,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
So the next is St. Francis Memorial Hospital.
I move to withdraw approval agency recognition from St. Francis Memorial Hospital.
I'll second that.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I know St. Francis Memorial Hospital in San Francisco. The description mentions CHA Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center as the correspondence site, and I wanted to ask, is that St. Francis Memorial in Southern California near Hollywood, or do we know? Or if it's part of the same healthcare organization, which I believe used to be Catholic Healthcare West, et cetera. If it's part of that system, but I don't know that Hollywood Presbyterian Medical would necessarily be part of the Catholic Healthcare West organization.
I'll pull that up for you right now.
And then just along the thought of my question, when it's a facility like a hospital, as opposed to an online learning environment, if we could include the primary location, the city,
Okay.
where they are, that will just help me to understand where they are, what the story is.
And this particular one is 900 Hyde Street, San Francisco, California.
Okay?
So we have a motion by Ms. McMillan and a second by Mr. Watkins. Any further board discussion?
And we'll make a correction to the briefing paper to correct the error of the state, or the agency.
Do you believe that the CHA Hollywood Presbyterian was simply
It's one of the previous ones before, and I think it's a cut and paste error, but the correspondence
Okay.
is definitely between.
St. Francis Memorial?
Francis.
Great, thank you.
So I just want to clarify what the exchange was here. Was CHA Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center? What was the mistake?
That should say the St. Francis Memorial Hospital.
So CHA Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, that's not,
That's
shouldn't
from
be
a
there.
previous, we've already gone through CHAs. So CHA is,
Can you refer to page numbers?
CHA is 265.
Yes.
So were you saying that it was removed at a previous board meeting already?
no, today.
We just did it. It was the third.
Oh, yeah.
It was the third one that we just removed.
But there's a cut and paste area, or error in the materials where CHA was included on St. Francis's briefing paper.
And what
Oh,
page
okay.
is that, 273?
That's on 273, correct, in the second paragraph,
Gotcha.
the last line.
Thank you. Any further board discussion? Any public comment? Roll call vote?
Alicia Benitez,
Aye.
TJ Walker,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katarina Elby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillan,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
And last, and 10th, is the Sonoma Psycho-Oncology.
I move to withdraw approval agency recognition from Sonoma Psycho-Oncology.
I second. We have a motion by Ms. McMillan, a second by myself. Any board discussion? Public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Alicia Benitez,
Aye.
TJ Walker,
Aye.
Jesus Dominguez,
Aye.
Daniel Drummer,
Aye.
Katarina Elby,
Aye.
Tanya McMillan,
Aye.
6-0, motion carried.
Public comment?
Now that you remove these agencies, what happens if someone's continuing education or their con ed hours are questioned? Are they required to maintain those records as they stated? And if they're removed, how do you follow these organizations if they're out of business? And how does the therapist prove that it was a certified or an approved agency that certified the Con Ed?
The requirement for the approval agency to retain the materials is still in place. The recognition of approval moving from this date forward won't exist. So when we're auditing a licensee, anything that happened, any classes attended or those kind of things that happened before today would still be credited. As far as enforcing documentation, retrieval, so because they're required 7 years, but applicants only required 5. If an applicant were to lose, or a licensee were to lose a certificate and ask that Sonoma Psychology, as an example, provide them a certificate, and Sonoma Psychology could not do that, we would have to address that on a case-by-case basis, and that consideration would be taken.
Jason, do you know in general if we've seen any action from any of these? The reason why they've been asked if they wanted to be removed is because we haven't heard from them, or?
No, so, and I was going to talk about this a little bit on the backside of it. When we talk about the continuing competency program and auditing, I think everybody thinks licensees first. But I think you'll see here, there was a great deal of effort done by staff just to maintain the current list and touching bases with them to make sure that they're still applying to the regulations that they agreed to in their application. And you'll see the outcome here is that some have asked for withdrawal, they've closed that company, they never started it for that matter, those kind of things. They filed an application not quite understanding that they might be able to attain those services from somebody else more easily. So just maintaining that list itself is quite a task. And that is essentially just making sure that they still want to be a recognized approval agency, not actually approving their policies just yet or investigating on a case-by-case basis based on a licensee's complaints of an approval agency or even a provider for that matter. So the continuing competency process and the maintenance of that process, I think, is starting to become much more clear to everyone, the level of staffing that is required to address that issue. And so you see here, just by the removal of 10, and the number of attempts of correspondence between us and them to make sure that they still want to be can span months. And, you know, the two staff that are tasked with doing this are also conducting audits of licensees, and based on those audits of licensees, sometimes stumble across these kind of things, but also just from trying to maintain the list itself. So.
A quick kind of just a sidebar comment. Will there be any dissemination of information that these folks are no longer approved providers? There's one in particular that is still involves quite significantly in education. And I just want to make sure that people, it's their responsibility to make sure they're going to an approved course. But I hate to say it, spoon feed them a little bit.
There will be. There on the board's website, there's a running list, and when changes are made, we indicate those changes and the timeframes that they apply to. We'll also indicate through our social media posts that, you know, this particular agency has removed its recognition as of, and there's even an alert box on the front page of the board's website that will be up temporarily. So after today, you know, we'll indicate all of these on the board's front page for 90 days, and then after 90 days, it's not new news or an alert anymore, so we'll take it down.
So, Dr. Sims, did you receive a copy of progress notes by eBlast by chance? No, I just signed it about 30 minutes ago. Okay, so you did not receive an eBlast for the first one?
Dr. Sims, do you have a current and valid email on file?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Just trying to figure out a good way to say that.
Yeah, so might have gone to, of the hundreds have got.
Or please check your, well, I can think the political term now is focus or other inbox instead of spam or junk.
Yeah.
But there, you'll find 2 different newsletters in there.
Okay,
If we have the right address on file.
great.
We're
Thanks.
still working out the kinks of getting that progress notes out, but that might be something else that we consider is posting those agencies that we no longer approve of on progress notes.
It's a very good point. As an experiment, we've talked about strategy and what we should send out as e-blasts before we start overstaying our welcome and people not appreciating all of the emails they receive from the Physical Therapy Board. But this could definitely be one of those that we send out an e-blast saying recognition for these 10 agencies was removed as of. Very quick and concise.
Thank you.
And I would just ask everyone to keep in consideration that just because I have an active and valid email address doesn't necessarily mean that I'm checking that inbox on a regular basis. And that is another piece of the challenge.
Yeah.
It absolutely is.
Any further board discussion on licensing services? Any further public comment? Thank you, Jason. I think we can move on. Do you want to move on to agenda item number 23, Consumer Protection Services Report?
Yes. So, as you'll see in standard format for this report, you will have the board's enforcement performance measures, as well as staff's report that they compile for our internal statistics. And then the third attachment, the list of discipline that was levied since the last board meeting. If you have any questions or anything that stands out to you, please feel free to ask.
Any board comment?
Just thank you to Ms. Ibarra for her continued work in this area and keeping the board informed.
Here, here.
I would also, off of Dr. Drummer's comment, like to kind of accentuate by saying, as you'll see in attachment 1, those performance measures are prepared and authored in report by the Department of Consumer Affairs, and we do not have them available to you. But again, in a step to be proactive, we essentially like to collect that data internally and also provide it as its own attachment so that the board is aware of the activities that the CPS staff have done.
And we thank you for that. Any public comment on consumer protection services?
Oh, I do have one other announcement that might be important to some in the room. With the recent addition to the board's web license lookup and the ability to search somebody by name or license number, sometimes it can make it difficult to just do a general report that you want to know for a period of time who was disciplined and when. But I think we've addressed that issue in our newsletter. And so you'll see in the new newsletter that the discipline levied in this newsletter starts where the last newsletter picked up or left off. And so we'll intend to do that moving forward. So if you're looking for just statistics even of what kind of complaints, that's a good source of information to be able to determine how many actions were taken in a given period of time and what kind of actions those were. And even a little bit deeper than that, who it affected, who the licensee was, and what they did for their recourse.
Any public comment? No? Oh, okay. I just want to say I do like the license lookup of Breeze. I think I have my license number memorized, but every once in a while I want to double check that I've got it right, and I can just look it up in seconds. So.
I will take the opportunity as like a shameless plug to pitch another feature of that. I love web license lookup, but there is one element that by creating a Breeze account that you can go in and create a notification for any of the licensed service providers that you might receive either healthcare services from or any of the other Breeze boards. So if you want to know about your dentist and you don't have time to constantly go back to the website and look all the time, you can actually create a subscription alert for that dentist. So if his status changes, if he gets in trouble or if he goes on probation, you as the consumer or any other interested party will receive an email notification letting them know that.
Mm-hmm. So. As a consumer, that is really interesting to learn.
I think that it's a good feature, and I think we have, and I can speak on behalf of DCA in this, is that we have plans on enhancing it even further. Right now, it only speaks to what we consider primary status, but sometimes the really important thing for that consumer is to know some of those things that we consider secondary statuses. So we're trying to adjust the system to account for both.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes, please.
James Sims, as a licentiate, just again, as I mentioned yesterday in the strategic plan, to speed up the timeline in which disciplinary activities get handled and taken care of. On this chart here, I get asked. They say, "How long does it take?" James, you know the board. You're involved in the stuff, so I get asked a lot of these questions. So I try to seek out the information first that I can try to understand before I irritate you folks and take up your time. But when I look at this here, on the one that says investigations aging, and I add up the first year to date on 2017, 18, 73%, 11, and 10, respectively, for 90, 180, and then a year. So if I told someone that 94% of activities are occurring within the first year, that'd be an accurate statement. Is that how I should characterize reading that?
That would be an accurate statement. There are very few cases that go outside of that date range. But
yeah, 7.
When they do, based on their complexity or the level of egregiousness, a case may warrant an investigation that takes a year and a half to 2 years. The other thing to keep in mind of that measure is that is from the inception of the complaint, the intake, the initial complaint, and the final resolution. And that final resolution might also include any appeals, placement on the OAH or the Office of Administrative Hearings calendar, however long it takes for the Office of the Attorney General to prepare that case, so start to finish. And a good deal of that timeline is outside of the board's control. So the PTBC staff and CPS staff do just about everything they can at this point to streamline the processes and stay on track, and even to the point of trying to keep the progress of our colleagues, either in investigation or in prosecution, and remind them or ask for updates frequently so that they understand we're in the wings waiting for the outcome of those things, just so we can keep them online. At this point, I think we've assessed that the average time and the overall goal is to resolve these things within about 540 days. My staff has whittled that down, our participation part of it, to about 280 days, so a little bit less than half. The rest of it really does have to do with the adjudication process itself, the prosecution, the Attorney General's involvement, or the investigation itself from the Department of Investigations.
Yeah, I'm personally familiar with the process, and I know, getting an investigator department, all those folks here, and I try to explain that to them. So, the board's not just sitting there twiddling their thumbs, and there's kind of due process, transparency that protects you if you're the accused person, and so that'd be, I just want to know how I can portray it and not be inaccurate and say, here's from what the board said at the last meeting. Right now, 90, that's a pretty, a year, guys, come on. And how long did you wait to file your complaint? You thought about it for however long maybe, so it's even add that to it that you were responsible for this person doing egregious behavior potentially, whatever. So as we do that, and so we all have responsibility for doing that, and then I'm sure the board does. So I share that with them. If you ever go to a board meeting or did your expert consultant training, you realize all that's involved in this, and obviously it's for due process stuff too. So thanks.
And because I can feel glares from CPS staff right now, I'll have to take this opportunity to say one of the contributing factors is the type of complaint we receive. So I would encourage anyone who is in the profession and filing a complaint and considering to do it anonymously, that they provide us as much information as possible, because a good deal of the complaints that we receive are, quite frankly, uninvestigatable. They might name a practice, but they don't name a victim, and they don't name a time or place or anything like that. So for us to really investigate it, we need a little bit more information, and that goes for consumers too. But the better quality complaint, the less time it takes to investigate.
And your question's a good question. We board members look at these charts each meeting, but we many times have the same questions that you do. So thank you for coming up and asking it. Yeah. And then going back to the license lookup, sorry to put you on the spot, Mitch, but I know in the past you've had some concerns about being able to look up certain licensees and if there was any discipline attached to the license. So do you have any feedback on if that's gotten any easier, or if you've been able to look at the Breeze feature at all?
Mitch K, licensee. I'm on Breeze at least 3 or 4 times a week. The organization I work for credentials all of our therapists, and so we check the board for any activity. There are a few cases that I'm at least once a week checking to see if after the hearing has that settled or not, because I understand that even though I have these people listed on my list, if there's a change in, or if there is a citation, or if they're been put on probation, it does not come up on that list. So no, I've not seen any advantage. There is a way of, I figured out, how to indicate all people, all PTs that are on probation. And that will give me a list, but you can't filter it as to dates. And so you get the whole list of people, and then you don't know what what is current versus what was from last time. Other than that, it's easy to put in names and find people and their license, and once you do that, you click the box to see if there are any outstanding complaints or actions against their license.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, any further discussion on, are we on the Consumer Protection Services report? Yep. Further discussion, board discussion, public comment? We ready to move on to the probation monitoring report? Agenda item number 24.
I am.
Yes?
So as you'll see, based on Mr. Martin's briefing paper about the status of the probation monitoring program, we're still, the attrition rate is true. We're still at about 84 probationers currently being monitored by a single monitor. And again, we've talked about that in the past. At that point, it's sometime in the near future, we're going to have to consider a second monitor to be able to divvy up that workload a little bit better. A good deal of the probationers reside in the Southern California region, which makes travel more of a requirement to do those first-time face-to-face accounts, or for more sensitive cases, things that we want to monitor at a stricter level, be able to assess somebody's demeanor and body language and that kind of thing. So face-to-face is a necessity. Having a second probation monitor is going to be a necessity at that point to continue to maintain that level. We are also in the throes of looking at standard number 4 for the substance abusing licensees, which really has to do with the bodily fluid testing. And so a panel of the executive officers are going to be making a determination as to whether or not the existing rule is appropriate, or if, because of advancements in technology and availability of those services, it's appropriate to adjust those numbers. And so that will affect Mr. Martin's, work performance on a day-to-day basis as well. So unless you have any questions, I think the report speaks for itself.
I just want to publicly thank Monty for the work that he does and the service that he provides to the board and consumers of California, and also all the information you put together for us. It's all very helpful, and we recognize your hard work. Thank you. Any other board comment or discussion? Public comment? Okay. Agenda item number 22, presentation discussion of application process for graduates of non-accredited programs located outside of the United States.
So it's unfortunate. I'm sorry, the news that I have to give you with that is that we're having some technical difficulties. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I will amend the agenda items with and send to you, but we're going to have to delay that presentation until the next board meeting. But including those materials, we'll also include them in the archive for the public also to be able to see, and so that they'll at least be that much better prepared before the presentation at the next meeting.
Thank you. Okay. Is there any public comment on items not on the agenda?
I apologize. This is kind of going back to a previous agenda item that Zoom passed me when I was probably being distracted by myself. On the proposed regs, how best can I find language? Afterwards, I was on AOLs, and I just laborious. I mean, it's real difficult. I can't find the regs that have been approved by the board and stuff, unless I go back and look at the past minutes and the past board. I mean, there's other ways, I guess, I can try to find, but is there an easier, quicker way for me to see the proposed regs? There's just one on the website, and I know there are about two of them that were identified today.
So the proposed regulations are on the board's website under a tab that we have web control over called proposed regulations. So you can see those materials on our website without having to go to like Westlaw or something outside. If the regulation is in effect, right now we are in contract with Westlaw, and so our regulations are referenceable there, but we have had some feedback that there's website difficulty in being able to retain those. We've experienced that ourselves. But the proposed rulemaking you will find on the rulemaking tab under proposed rulemaking.
Yeah, I clicked on there's just one, and I thought there were a couple or two of them that we talked that were announced today. That back in a March meeting, you approved the language.
So the rulemaking,
I just want to clarify that we're discussing agenda item 15, is that right? The rulemaking report?
Yeah, on the rulemaking, yeah.
Rulemaking.
You have a very nice, I mean, it's a nice graphic in terms of where it is in the process. I mean, that's cool. I can see, you know, kind of what happened when, stuff like that. If I wanted to see the text of that was approved, that's what I was just looking for. And didn't know there's any tricks that I don't know about, where to find it easier.
I think we're still waiting on the text, the language.
Wow, that's a good point. So I see what you're saying. Because of where the language is, well, actually, those two could be added to it now the board's adopted. As soon as legal has approved that language to move forward, it'll show up on this page.
Okay, that's where, so I'm going to the right spot. Yeah, because that's where I've gone in the past. I've seen some things that are coming up and things, so.
And while there's only one there now, it's because that was the only one that's made it past that review process.
And again, kind of an attaboy, and thank you guys for coming to these locations to hold meetings that hopefully we get better turnouts and stuff like that. But I hope you don't stop trying, because it's I think it's valuable. And one of these days we hit a grand slam. Sometimes it's a rain delay, a rain out. It's still me, Daniel. Yep, still supporting others. So thank you guys again.
Also, if the board had looked at, if the board did look at some kind of proposed language, it would be in the materials as well.
Right, that's what I said. I can go back and look at past minutes and or board materials and see what's happening. And then the next meeting minutes, the minutes would show if you guys change it during that meeting and the new language will come out. Yeah, I mean, there's other ways. I just wondered if there's a quicker way. Because I usually go that one page, just click on it, where proposed regs. I know it look like, darn, there's only the one there. These other two weren't there, so help. Thanks.
Yep. Any other public comment on items not on the agenda? We do have some members of the public here, a physical therapy student as well. Yes. Sure. We'd like to invite you up and ask any questions about anything regarding the board and its role, or anything that you're curious about.
Sorry for my appearance today. I have 2 midterms, so that's why my appearance is like this.
Sure.
But
Sure, go ahead and introduce
to
yourself.
obviously get involved early on. So I just asked, what would you suggest as to how, as a student, to obviously fulfill the academic requirements and also try to fulfill the professional networking and integration with also communication with boards?
Doing exactly what you're doing right now. Being in school, taking your exams, successfully passing your exams, because you'll do that. And then trying to get to a meeting, or at least get to see the webcast of the meeting, so that you can just get a flavor of the things that are happening, and how the board, the actions that the board takes, how the board interacts with the members of the public, the licensees. When yesterday we had 2 cases, 2 hearings that the board was responsible for trying to decide if the petitions were to reinstate, one was to reinstate a license and the other was to reduce the probation that had already been that had been imposed on a licensee. And that process is pretty intense, but it's so valuable to see and to experience, and just to get a flavor of what kinds of things happen to a licensee when they're faced with discipline by the board because they didn't do something that they were supposed to do, or they did something that they weren't supposed to do as a licensee.
I'd like to add to your point about networking, getting involved with the professional associations and attending their conferences. It's a great way to get some new information and also engage with other PTs.
I can't speak highly enough about engagement with the board itself, right? So just understanding the role of the regulatory board as maybe opposed to the role of the professional association, what we're responsible for, what they're responsible for, and also keeping in mind that just about every aspect of what this board is responsible for has a public involvement component. When it comes to regulations, we want to seek out the licensant's opinion, and their opinions matter. They have to be addressed in the record, and the board would opine whether or not adjustment is made. I would much rather have licensees participate in the regulatory process and provide that feedback and maybe have an effect on the way that language is written than to have the regulation go in effect and then to call the board that they're not satisfied with the way the regulation was created. We really want that participation. So, and then having said that, participation in board meetings, attending webcasts, those kind of things, staying up to date on the laws and regulations and knowing them, this is one of the easiest ways to do it is by watching those webcasts. You know, or even, you know, the webcasts that we have recorded yesterday and today are going to be archived on our YouTube channel. You can watch them at your leisure and whatever's convenient time for you. And as Dr. Drummer attested to, those two hearings that were conducted yesterday are part of that webcast. So you still have an opportunity to go back and watch them to see what played out and see how it might affect your future moving forward.
Can I add to your comments, Jason, about being engaged with the board? Potentially serving on the board yourself as a licensee would be an excellent way to be engaged with the profession.
And from all of you, actually, when did you determine that you had enough experience to participate on the board?
Wow.
When the governor's office called.
There's a minimum set of qualifications, and one is that you have to have been licensed for 5 years, and that you can't have any discipline on your record. There are some conflict of interest things that might rule you out as a member, but after that, it really does have to do with just filing an application and being selected by either the governor, the assembly, or the Senate. And they will contact you and reach out and have an interview, and you might end up being up on this board one day also. That's not the only way you can participate. We also have expert consultants, so every complaint that is fielded through the board, an expert consultant can be assigned to that complaint who is a licensee, again, licensed for 5 years, no discipline. And if we have enough expert consultants, we'll try to match up either demographics or geographic and even specialty. And we need them to help our sworn peace officers investigate a complaint. And so expert consultants are always, we're always short on the list. We can always use more. The more that we have and the more expertise we have, the more selective we can be and try to tailor that expert consultant for that type of case. So we'll be looking for that in the future too.
Also, I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not a physical therapist assistant. I'm a child care provider. And so I am a public member. And so being a part of this board is really, for me, has been very rewarding. But I think it also brings the public's perspective to this field. And that plays a really intricate part of what happens around, on this board. So.
Question was, how do we, about qualification, how did we know we qualified? I think the most important thing, not just for a board, but for anything that you do, is going to always come down that you have to have a sense of who you are. Because if you don't know who you are and can sit real tight in it, you'll be moved by the forces. And whenever you have to sit on a board and your mandate is public protection, you will feel the winds that will come towards you. And then you have to really know who you are. So my best advice is, make it the inward journey as well. To become a real pro, you're going to learn many of the skills that you will require is going to be the kind of skills that you will not learn unless you get out there and get knocked around. And it will knock you down. It will knock you down, and you will get up, and then you will learn, okay, I won't do that, or I have to be a little bit more sure-footed. That's my 2 cents.
TG's our resident psychologist, life coach, and extraordinaire.
Right now, you're our junior colleague right now, but soon you will be part of the profession, and very quickly you'll be able to contribute, very quickly. So don't ever feel like you're not enough, because you'll be enough to serve.
Well, thank you very much for all of your time and you coming here to Western University.
Good luck to you. Yeah. Any further public comment on items not on the agenda? And any agenda items for future meetings? Our future meeting, our next one will be in Sacramento, September 13th and 14th, 2018. Any agenda items from board members? From public? So it looks like we will be moving into closed session. We'll take a short recess now, then move into closed session. And after closed session, there are no further items on the agenda. And we will briefly come back to announce that we're going to adjourn the meeting. And the time is 11:46. We'll take a short recess and reconvene at noon. Closed session.